again. Also, we will be taking questions. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a question and answer session. However, as we're going along, please, if you have any question come to mind as a result of what Ann is discussing, please feel free to type that into the question bar, which you should see on your screen. I will be tracking those questions, and I will pose them to Ann at the end. If we don't get to all of them, they are included in our report, so we will be able to follow up with you if you are interested. Okay, so we're going to get started. I have one person who's asking if the access code is working. To my knowledge, yes. You may need to hang up and dial in again. I'm sorry about that. That does occasionally happen with this platform. But we do have feedback that other people are on, so I hope you are able to get on our webinar. All right, we're going to get started. So today's webinar, as you know, is brought to you by DCL. And before we get started, actually, we're going to do a quick poll. So that should show up on your screen momentarily. I'm going to launch that now. Oops, sorry about that. Selecting my poll. This one is pretty much the easiest poll we've ever asked. Have you attended a previous webinar in this series? So if you can let us know, just because I think that will help Ann tailor her comments to the audience a little bit. You guys got the easy question today. Okay, I'm going to take about a minute here while people continue to vote. And when the voting slows to a halt, we will close out the poll. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone who's voting. All right, I'm going to close the poll in 5 seconds. And 3, 2, 1, and we're closing the poll. We are seeing 71% of you have not attended a previous webinar with Ann. So thank you so much for joining us today. 29% of you have. So that will certainly help Ann when she comes on momentarily. I'm going to hide our poll results. Now I'm going to give you a very quick overview of DCL, where I work quite happily, and then we'll get going with our webinar. Data Conversion Laboratory, as many of you may know, we do data conversion. Your valuable content transformed. That is everything from ebooks to massive amounts of automated conversion and pretty much everything you can imagine in between. And I'm getting some feedback that we are having trouble seeing my screen. Okay, here we go. Wonderful. We should be up and operating again. Sorry about that. We serve a very broad client base here at DCL. Pretty much everything you can imagine. Spanning all industries, from aerospace, military, life sciences, to publishing, and also self-publishing, which is really interesting, and of course life sciences and medical. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ann, and then we're going to do a quick switch off where she will begin to handle the webinar, so there'll be a little bit of a passing of the torch here. Ann Rockley, who we are delighted to have with us today, and who's a longtime partner and friend of DCL, is CEO of the Rockley Group. She has a fantastic reputation for developing multi-channel content strategies, and something I didn't know when I began working with Ann is she is known as the mother of content strategy. She introduced the very concept, so you are speaking to someone with a great deal of knowledge and history in the industry. I think at the end you'll get to see a cover of her book, Managing Enterprise Content, a Unified Content Strategy, and learn a little bit more about what she is doing in the future. And now I'm going to happily hand this over to Ann. Ann, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yep. And I'm going to change the presenter now. So if you will all bear with us while Ann and I switch places. Okay, Ann.
Okay, you should be seeing my screen, I believe.
Yep, there you go.
Okay, great.
I love a smooth transition.
just go to the full screen. There we are.
Okay.
Okay, so thanks very much. And just to give you a little bit of background, these are some of the companies that we've worked with life sciences and healthcare. We also do work in other fields as well, finance, high tech, those sorts of things. But since our focus today, these are some of them. And when we work with these organizations, what we're trying to do typically is to go in and get an understanding how companies are creating and managing their content now. And then we help them to move forward to more productive and effective ways of delivering that content to their customers, to regulatory, whomever has to receive that content. It often involves content management. It definitely involves content strategy. And it almost always involves an ROI. I would say 9 out of 10 of the projects that we work on involves an ROI or return on investment. So what is an ROI? Well, it stands for return on investment. And it's typically a key component of any business case that you put together for, generally for purchasing content management systems or doing a content strategy, that sort of thing. Everything costs money. And when you're going to spend company money, they want to know, well, what am I going to get for this? What is the return on investment? When we look at it in a very general sense, it's essentially savings less your potential costs. Now, when we look at ROI, one of the things that I think is important for companies to realize is that it doesn't make sense to do it for a single year. So let's just say, for example, you were developing an ROI now, and you might say do it for year 2014. That's a bit too short. And the reason for that is you can typically most of your costs, admittedly, are in the first year, but you don't see all of the savings in the first year. That tends to extend into the second year and completely generally is realized by the third year. So we generally do our ROI over 3 years. Some of the things that we have found is that typically you can recoup your costs of going towards content management and content strategy in a year to 18 months. A year's pretty aggressive. To do that, you need to have something like a lot of translation or something like that, which I'll come back to. But more often it's 18 months. Very, very rarely run over 2 years before costs are recouped. Most of the things that happen in your first year are your development of your intelligent content strategy, so figuring out what you're going to do with the content, how you're going to organize it, how you're going to structure it, and then bringing any new tools in as well. If you are converting your content from unstructured content to structured content, structured modular content, often that conversion happens in the first year as well, though in some cases companies do a pilot in the first year and the conversion costs are more likely to happen in the second. It really depends. You need enough content to actually work with in order to start realizing savings. So going back a little bit to some of the first two, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail since many of you did not participate in those webinars. But when we're looking at life sciences and healthcare and trying to understand, well, where are the problem areas? What is the pain that an organization is feeling? And a lot of these things are true. I would say everything on here, with possibly the exception of InDesign publishing, is true for most companies, is that needing to figure out where the problems are occurring. So if we think about version control, that we've seen version control, regulatory requirements, translation, claims, publishing, and multiple device publishing. Now I do have a slide on each of these. So version control. One of those is big issues. I've come into companies where they will say things like, oh, we had a real problem last year. Somebody accidentally picked up the wrong version of some content, and they started making changes to the wrong version. Well, that's a real issue because between the version that they're working on and potentially the most current version, there were probably corrections made, there was new content added, there were reviews and sign-offs and all sorts of things that happened in there to ensure that the content was accurate. And if you pick up something old, then you're missing all of that, and that's a real issue. So when we look at version control, we often try to quantify what happens when somebody accidentally picks up an old version. It's so easy. It's stuck in their email. It's on some server somewhere. It's not properly named. Who knows? Also, we see a lot of issues where people are trying to find the most current version. They can't find it. They're not sure where it is, or is this the most recent one? So what does it cost to spend time looking for information? That's something that you can measure. That's something that you can use in your ROI. So figuring out what are the costs of these things. What happens if, and we see this a lot as well, when you've got to manage multiple parallel versions of the same content? Let's take something like labeling. Well, you're probably producing content for the US, for the EU, for Japan, EMEA, all over the place. You're creating content. And you need to ensure that your content is correct for each of those regulatory agencies. Well, if you're having to manage multiple versions of the same content, it can get not only complex, but also costly as you're trying to ensure that, well, I needed to update it here. Did it get updated correctly somewhere else? This piece of information is not used. It's used in a slightly different way, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another area where we typically try to figure out, well, what does it cost an organization to manage that type of information? What about if you're managing multiple similar but slightly different versions of content? So we might have a situation where there are different variations, say, on a product. And we have one version which applies to one set of the product. You've got another one that applies to another, too many words of versions there, versions of the product. And you want to make sure, again, that you've picked up the correct one, that you're managing them. What if something changed? It affects both of those pieces of information, but you need to make sure that you still keep them separate. So that's another area that you could potentially cost. The one that we find that stands out the most often is definitely the first one, which is wrong versions of content, picking up the wrong one. So how can an intelligent content strategy, and for those of you have missed this in the past, well, intelligent content, what we're looking at in that type of information. So you think of content strategy where we're figuring out how we're going to structure, organize, write, control, etc., our information. Well, when we add intelligence to that information, we are physically structuring it, so it is structured content. That enables us to do a variety of different things with that content, publish it in multiple places. It allows us to hide and show information. We would add things like metadata to that information so that we can store it, we can retrieve it, we can automatically build on that content. It is content which is separate from format, so that we can say, well, I'm going to take this same piece of content and I'm going to publish it to the web, and I'm going to publish it to print, as in InDesign. I'm going to publish it to a mobile device. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about intelligent content. So when we think about version control, the best way to address that issue is typically with a content management system, because it automatically does it for you. What about regulatory requirements? So as I said, you've got a variety of different ones. You need to know what is required in each situation. So we try to measure what is the cost to create multiple versions of the content to meet different regulatory needs. Sometimes there's a lot of rework happening in there, a lot of rewriting. Other organizations develop something like an English master, and from there it splits. What does it cost you to update that content in many different locations? So trying to find all those different versions. We were working with a company recently, and they were publishing a label, a package label, you know, a sticky label that would go on a box or the actual medical device, something like that. And they had to update the information in 600 different locations. It was huge. It was a big change. And it was like, well, what does that cost you? So we look to figuring out, is that something that would make a good number for us to use in the ROI? So when we're managing regulatory requirements, there's a number of different things that we can use that will help us to address those costs. The first one being reuse. So write the content once and reuse it in multiple places. Think of cautions, think of notes, think of specific information about something that doesn't change, that can be the same. Also things like legal notices and stuff like that. So reuse is a big one, and I will show you how we can use reuse to calculate ROI. As I said earlier, your version control, and then your content models. And when content models are one of the things that you need to put together for your content strategy. And what a content model does is it says, okay, if I'm creating this type of information, so maybe I'm putting together marketing information, well, that type of information must include, maybe it's something like a teaser, maybe it's a product description, maybe it's features and benefits, et cetera, and it may be reusing some of those cautions or notes that you might have produced for the labeling information. So each of those models, we can develop one for each of our agencies or regulatory requirements so that we can automatically pull those pieces that are in common and have guidelines for the pieces that are specific to that agency. Translation is a biggie. I always tell companies that if you're translating into 4 or more languages, there's a good chance that you can recoup your costs in a year or less even. We had one company a few years back who translated their content into 27 different languages, and they were able to, after they'd done their intelligent content strategy and brought in content management and things like that, they had a 270% return on investment, meaning they more than saved the cost of putting their new system, methods, models, everything else in place, simply with translation savings. It was huge. So if you translate your content, this is one of the areas where you're probably going to see your biggest payback. So I'm always asking companies, well, do you translate your content? And how much do you spend in a year in terms of translation? That's an important number to know. Then we always have, what does it cost to make a change? We often see issues where the content, in order to get, and this is what I typically see when I come in, and it's not the way we set it up towards the end, but often in the beginning, a company is translating their content early on in the cycle because they have a really long lead time for translation. And in order to make sure that they've got the translated materials available when they want to ship, they have to start early. But when you start early, then you've got a lot of changes because information is not yet finalized. So you're changing right up to the end. Now, once you move towards intelligent content, which is modular content, any content which has previously been translated can be translated and automatically reused. You don't have to translate it again. And then when you have, when you're getting close to the end, you would have fewer and fewer modules or components of information that are changing. So you don't have to send it all out again. You just send out what has changed so that can be reduced. So what is the cost of change? In some companies, I've found it can be huge. It's quite phenomenal how much they're spending on that. What about translation to publish your content in multiple channels? One of the things with translation is use a translation memory system. In a translation memory system, it takes a look at the content and it matches it to what it already has in its database to say, okay, we've already translated this previously. Well, one of the things that what you have in different channels, so let's say you've got HTML content. Well, it's wrapped in HTML tags. Let's say you've got Microsoft Word content. Well, it's wrapped in RTF tags, or if you're using the more recent version, the form of XML tags. If you are doing something like InDesign, then it's wrapped in those style tags. Each of those tags are recognized when it's doing the comparison of the content. And even if you have the exact same words between the tags in the HTML and the tags that you have in InDesign, it's different because the tags are different. So if we can pull our content back, and as I said with intelligent content, it's format free, so typically it's XML, though it doesn't have to be, but that's typically what we use most of the time. There is no format related to those. It's very structural tags. So that's a huge savings. You can create your content once, you translate it once, and you can publish it out wherever you want. So that's where you say you got huge savings in there. So reuse plays a big role in the savings in terms of translation. I probably should have on here. Also, format free plays a big role. Workflow plays a big role because we can manage the content and say, okay, this is only what has changed. Let's send out what has changed, not everything all over again. And then if you are doing things like InDesign publishing, which is particularly important in many life sciences companies because of all the print-based materials that you need to create, instructions for use, package inserts, boxes, all that kind of stuff, certainly from the labeling side. You generally pay to have your content put back into the InDesign or even put back into the HTML or anything else. And you can automatically do that because you've got the format-free content. So that's a huge savings. So we often see 50% or more savings in terms of, and I'm using air quotes here, so desktop publishing. So the kind of tagging system for layout that you would use, that you eliminate it. Gone. Don't need it anymore. When you're talking about life sciences information, it's particularly important that when you say something, whether it be in your marketing information, whether it be in your labeling information, whether it even be often in healthcare information, is that you can say, this is true, and this has been verified, and this is how we can prove that it is true and verified. And you need to be able to point to, who knows, a clinical report. You need to point to something else that says, this is how we know that this information is accurate. You have to prove that. You have to show that on an ongoing basis. And this can be pretty tricky to keep track of. A lot of times companies are doing this all manually. And I've seen it where they've created like Excel spreadsheets, and you've got the content in, say, one cell, and then you've got what supports that content in another one. But if that piece of content is also included in another piece of information, there's no way of sharing the fact that these things are tied together because you pretty much got to copy-paste. So they're tracking it in many, many, many places. And in some cases, you may end up where, okay, it was tracked for the last version, and now we're starting off on a new version. And, well, where is all that tracking? How do you find out what it was associated with? So what does it cost to do all of that tracking? It can be incredibly manual. So if we're thinking about intelligent content, what we're doing is we say this piece of content is supported by this information. And what that piece of information is just a piece of metadata. So you've got a list of resources or references. You just pick from the list. It attaches it to that component of information. That component of information gets reused somewhere else. It's always there. If it gets updated, it's still there. You can change them, delete them, add them, whatever you want. So that can be extremely powerful. And again, with the reuse. So once you've attached this information and content's reused, it's everywhere that it's reused. InDesign publishing, as I said, is quite important with print-based materials. And many companies either have an entire department devoted to layout and InDesign publishing, and there's a lot of work associated with reviewing that final content to make absolutely sure that any changes have been made to it are correct, accurate, completely there, not missing, all those sorts of things. So they may have an internal group, or they may send it out to an agency. So the agency then lays everything out, and again, you've got that high proportion of review and checking and things like that. And when we often go into companies, more often than not, they're managing their content in the InDesign. Or they could be, if they're more web-based materials, they could be managing it in the HTML. When you're talking with intelligent content, we want to pull it back from what we consider to be the output, in this case InDesign or web or anything else that somebody is publishing the content to. You don't manage it there. You pull it back to XML, format-free content. And when you do that, then InDesign simply becomes an output. And you can automatically publish into, and I stress the word, structured template. So it says, this is what my structure is, and this is where it belongs. And so we can treat it as an output. If anything changes, you just republish it to, and I mean republish not in the sense of final print and things like that, but you simply pour that content into that template, and it's accurate wherever that content appears because you never make changes in an output, ever. You always go back to the source, and that's huge savings in that area as well. Multi-device publishing, more and more, it's certainly not just about print. It's not just about the web. Now we're publishing to smartphones. We're publishing to tablets. We're making our content available in a variety of different ways. And a lot of companies are recreating their content. So they create it for the web, and then they recreate it for different devices or different channels. So again, we bring it in intelligent content. We bring it back to the source. We bring it back to format-free content. And then we can publish to any device. All we need to publish to a device, to InDesign, to the web, anything, is a style sheet. Now, granted, it takes time, takes money to create one of those style sheets. But once it's created, then all we do is just keep pouring our content through it. And you can have many different style sheets that the look and feel that comes out of them is entirely different. But our names of our styles remain the same. So it's very, very easy to change look and feel very, very quickly. So again, we treat our multiple devices as an output only. We take our content from that single source, and we publish it out. Okay, so those are some of the areas where we typically see good numbers that we can pull for ROI. So let's really get into the numbers. The first thing I always ask for is, what is the average salary cost? Why do I want to know about salary? Well, because I'm hoping that as we produce new information using the content strategy, the methodologies, the content management, is we're going to be able to have some savings here. And I'll come back to sort of how I represent those salary savings, because the goal is not to reduce headcount. The goal is to free up headcount so they can do more with the same money you're already spending. But I need to know what's an average salary. I don't need to know everybody's, but you need to know what's an average one and make sure that it's got benefits and overhead in it. And if you're using more contractors than permanent, well, what do they cost? And you have to have this in order to figure out how much is being saved. We often need to know, well, how long does it take to do something? So whether it's authoring something, because I can't show savings unless I can figure out, well, it normally takes 6 weeks or 6 months or whatever it happens to be to do something. So how long does it take to author it? How long does it take to edit it? How long does it take to review it? How long does it take to publish it? What are other things? What can we say in there? And often we extrapolate it out. So we'll say, okay, we produce X number of whatever over the course of the year, and it takes so many weeks to produce that, and it's broken out this way, and we're going to save 15%, 25%, whatever it is. We can see that, and then we can extrapolate out to, oh, well, we do, 100 of those in the course of the year. We also need to look at the revenue opportunity, because we involve a lot of people in the content creation and delivery process who do other things. That's what I always, and again, I'm using those air quotes again, their real job. So somebody who, a reviewer might be a subject matter expert. In the life sciences, they might be a doctor. They might be somebody with PhD. They might be somebody in engineering if it's a medical device. They might be, a variety of different people. And A, they're expensive, and B, typically they're either occasional reviewers, or if they're permanent, they're generally developing new product. So if we can reduce the amount of time they spend reviewing content, then we can free them up to do other things. So we look at it as a revenue opportunity. What is the value of what they do? So you can turn it around and look at it as revenue in addition to savings. What about consistency and accuracy? Oh, I don't know how many companies I've gone into where, well, I said before, where somebody had an older version and it got out, and well, that was an error and that cost money. We had one medical device company that justified their entire project on things like risk mitigation. So making sure that content was absolutely accurate and there were no changes. And you can do things like, what about reduced support calls? What about unhappy customers? What about legal suits? There's a variety of different things. Quantify it. Anything that you feel is important to the organization. The company I was just talking about, they had gone to management 3 years running trying to get budget to move forward with their content strategy and content management system, and 3 times they were turned down. 4th time, as I said, they used the risk mitigation. They had it very quickly, like they barely walked out of the room when they had the approval on it, because that was a hot button for management and they cared about that. What about faster time to market? When we think about life sciences products, you're always competing against somebody else. If they get their product to market faster, they get the lion's share of the market. Well, can you reduce the time frame and therefore get your product out to market faster? Well, this is the opportunity cost. Now, opportunity cost we often set aside. We don't necessarily use it in our ROI. It's always there. We had a pharmaceutical a number of years back that estimated like they had a 35% opportunity cost, and they could save $1 million a day by getting their content out there faster and obviously getting the product approved faster. So that can be one that you use as well. But that's one you have to be careful with, because it's not real until it's realized. I always like to work on the savings first, but this one's always here as a backup. Obviously, improved productivity. People are not wasting time looking for information. They're not wasting time rewriting information. They're not wasting time checking that content is accurate in multiple places. So we can do a lot of savings in terms of productivity. One of the big numbers, I talked about translation, one of the other big numbers that we tend to work with is reuse. So in most companies, we find typically that a minimum of 25% of their content can be reused. Sometimes much, much more. It could be lower than that. We've seen, say, 15% in one area, but up to 70% in another. So you average it out. But we typically see a minimum of 25%. And that means that you're saving 25% on creating content, 25% on reviewing content, 25% on translating content, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a pretty important number. So how do you put a dollar value on this? It's often a percentage of reuse times the length of time somebody spends on something times their salary, or reuse times time times increased revenues, or it could be reuse times time frame to complete a project, reuse times translation costs, reuse on time spent searching for content, because I like to automate reuse wherever I can. So you don't have to look for it. It's already there. The system has found it. It can be reduced support costs, as I said earlier, and this is not associated necessarily with reuse, though it could be. As I said, you could reduce the amount of your legal suits. So where are your costs? We have them in a variety of different areas. So authoring tools. And people who have attended these webinars have come from all over the place. So I've got 3 different values in here. I've got US dollars, I've got British pounds, and I've got euros. And these are based on fairly recent conversions, so, you know, I kind of round it up a bit. But if you're going to go towards structured content, there's a good chance you either need to upgrade your existing tools so that you go to a structured version, or maybe you even have to buy new ones. So that can be $500 to $700 US a seat. You could have a low-cost CMS, and I thought about including it here, but I decided against it. And I generally find low-cost content management systems are low-cost for a reason. They may not be as fully functional. They may not have the same level of support. They may not do a variety of different things. That's not to say that's always true, but often I can't bring them in because they don't meet financial requirements or some other requirements. So I've simply said not applicable here. Now, mid-range, this is generally where I try to find a content management system, and this is generally client-server versus software as a service, you know, cloud-based. So generally around about $200,000 in US dollars. Now, you could go up as high as $1 million, and I've seen that. Obviously, that's really expensive, and I try not to go there. I don't really think there's a need to go that high most of the time, but occasionally it does happen. We have to think about that people will also need training. So we need to think about the people who are probably on the core team bringing in your intelligent content strategy or content management. Well, they need to learn all about analysis. Who's going to create those content models? Who's going to create all of the underlying content strategy? You also may need to understand information architecture like metadata. If you're going to XML, somebody's got to learn how to create the XML structures like DTDs and XSLs, which are XML style sheets for your publication. Certainly you can contract all of this out, but it's really nice if you can bring some of these skills in-house. Maybe you work with your IT group. Maybe there's someone within your team that you can grow into this role. You might need someone to help you to configure the tools. Maybe it needs to tie into a variety of different systems. And then, of course, last but not least, is you need to train everybody how to use the new system. And so there's cost there. If you have your content in unstructured information, so whether it be in Word, in InDesign, possibly FrameMaker, you know, whatever it's in, you've got to convert it to a structured version. That means your content models, you'd have to know what your content models are. So you can say, I want to map this unstructured information to this structure, and this is how they map. So, and also you need to break up your information. So you may go to files, from files down to modules or components. Unstructured content is structured. I also like to identify reuse at that time if I can. So if I can say, run an analysis and say, okay, all of this content is reusable, therefore we don't have to convert it 2 times or 3 times or however many times we can reuse it. We simply say, okay, we're going to convert it once, and then everywhere it's reused, we'll pull it into that place. You're probably going to have consulting costs. So you might need a consultant who's going to come in, is going to help analyze your situation, develop your content strategy, recommend the tools, maybe do systems integration, I don't know. So what are the potential costs of that consulting? There is lost productivity. In any time you change your processes and you go from one thing to another, it takes a bit of time for people to get up to speed, and that's pretty standard. But I also like to bring in the cost of bringing in a team of people who are going to work with us or whomever your consultants are as you're doing the analysis, as you're doing the design, as you're doing the proof of concept, the pilot, the prototype, all those sorts of things. And that's going to take a chunk out of people's time. So a lot of people don't like what I have to say here, but this is certainly optimum. And so the shorter the time frame, the more people and time you need from them. But I generally ask for 3 to 5 people, a minimum of 50% of their time for about 6 months. And I know I almost never get that. They end up doing their day job at night. It's also really important to have a project manager. So you've got somebody who's dedicated to making sure that all these things happen. And that may cost time and money. As I said, there's time to get people up to speed. So again, going back to what is the ROI, it's your savings less your costs. You do it over 3 years. I always suggest to people to be realistic, but be conservative. I had a company a couple of years ago that came back. They put in their new content strategy, their content management system. They were doing extremely well. And she said that, that they had a much higher return on investment than they had budgeted for as part of the ROI, and how come we didn't budget for that? And most of their savings were in the translation, which was where they were saving. And I said to them, I said, well, it makes a lot of sense to be conservative because you can achieve that, rather than highly optimistic and fail to meet those numbers. And also, when you take your numbers to senior management, they're going to really ask you where those numbers came from. And if they see huge, huge, huge savings, they're not going to believe you. Even if it's true, they're not going to believe you. They're going to say, hey, we think these are unrealistic. So we try to say, okay, well, maybe we could get up to 70% reuse, but that's probably a bit crazy. So maybe do 25 or 35. Maybe we're going to be able to replace certain, have fewer contractors, have more people who are doing full-time work, can handle more. Who knows? It really depends. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we try to do whenever we're talking about resources is we reposition it, because it's not our goal to have companies lose headcount. That should not be the goal. I don't know a single company that's able to do all the things that they need to be able to do with their existing resources, and you can never get budget for new resources. So we talk about a resource shift, and that means we may be reducing some of the existing resources, but maybe we're going to grow them into new roles. We often grow people into the content strategy role. We often grow people. You might have somebody in your group who really likes technical things and they'd like to be a system administrator, or they would like to do more of the style sheets or things like that. So it's not so much you have to justify new headcount, you're shifting what you've got. You may be able to reduce contractor costs. You may be able to simply say, look, we've got, say, 5 people, but if we can free up 1.5 or 2 of those people, they can be doing more for the same. So they actually are able to become more productive, do more things, because we've been able to increase their productivity. So in summary, when you're talking about ROI, it's savings less cost over 3 years. Try to limit the new headcount by shifting resources, and be conservative. Better to realize a higher return on investment than not to meet your goals. Now, I wanted to tell you about a few resources that you might be interested in, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So the book that Jennifer spoke about in the beginning, Managing Enterprise Content, a Unified Content Strategy, that book is now in its 2nd edition, and it provides a lot of information on how to develop a content strategy. What do you need to know about tools, et cetera, et cetera. And so you might find that of interest. We have been running the Intelligent Content Conference. I founded that in 2009, and we have decided to have a specialized one this year. There's going to be 2, one in February, our regular Intelligent Content Conference, and then a specialized one for life sciences in May of 2014. So you might be interested in that one. I talked a lot about numbers, but we didn't get into spreadsheets and things like that. You will find an ROI calculator on our site, which has some of the basic numbers in it. It's not perfect. It's a starting point, but it's something you can use and see what kind of results you come up with. I also wrote 2 articles for the DCL newsletter. And first one, Intelligent Content, what is it? And how does it affect life sciences and healthcare? And then how do you actually develop an intelligent content strategy for that? So there's 2 links there. So now I'm going to open it up to questions. You can see our contact information there. And happy to answer any questions you may have.
Anne, thank you so much. We have a couple of questions coming in. I did just want to mention as a housekeeping item, I saw on my screen a couple of you have hands raised, which is one of the options in the program. I did put all hands down, again, in air quotes there, and if you could ask any questions in the question field on your screen, that would be great, and I will make sure Anne gets those. And we've had a couple of people who had queries about your previous 2 webinars in this series, and since a lot of our audience was not present for that, maybe you could just give a very quick overview. I do want to add that, yes, those webinars are available. I know for certain the first one is posted on our website, dclab.com. I believe the second one is going up soon if it's not up already. They are typically difficult to email, but it is a possibility if anyone cannot, for some reason, access it on our site. So, Anne, if you could just talk a little bit about the first 2 and how they threaded into this one.
Well, when we first started talking about this whole area of life sciences, which is a big area that we work in and wanted to share with you, we sort of realized pretty quickly that, wow, we couldn't fit it all in one. So the first webinar is more of a discussion where we talked about, what are some of the challenges that life sciences healthcare companies are facing, what is intelligent content, and how you could use intelligent content to address some of those challenges. And that's also in the first article. The second one was on developing an intelligent content strategy. And when I talk about an intelligent content strategy, what we're typically talking about is developing content models, structured content models, a reuse strategy, and a metadata strategy. So I talked about how you could go about developing those, and there are a variety of examples in there. And again, the second article that I gave you the link for is ties you back to the article that I wrote that sort of summarized and supported that. But there are examples in the webinar. There are not examples in the actual article.
Okay. We have a question here from Rebecca. How do you feel the trends toward community content fit into a content strategy, and can you consider it in ROI?
Community is obviously extremely important, as is, so going out, communicating with the customer, and then having your customers share back into your information set. Now, there's some pros and cons to that. When we think about it in the life sciences area, one of the challenges always is in terms of the accuracy of that content and the issues of privacy. We have to be very, very careful with privacy issues in this sector. So we agree that it's really important. One of the areas that we have found to be extremely useful, things like stories, case studies, anecdotes, those sorts of things of people talking about what they've learned or how they manage their health or whatever the case may be. I would generally not include it as part of the ROI in terms of the hard numbers. I would include it more in terms of the soft numbers, which I think of as opportunity costs, things like that. So improving customer relations, increasing your community interaction, feeding that kind of information in is a lot harder to measure, but it is a great opportunity, and there's definitely ways in which you can improve what you're doing today based on this. So as a secondary cost, but maybe not the primary cost that we're using to prove what we're doing.
Great, thank you. We have another question. I love this one from Christine. This is something we encourage and think a lot about here at DCL. Can you talk about what change management is needed to succeed in your methodology?
Yes, change
right?
management. Absolutely. There is a lot of change management, I will admit it. But once change happens, it's generally people are pretty happy with it. So where is the change? There is change from the content contributor aspect, because instead of creating sort of free-form content and potentially creating all of something, they may be creating a piece of something, and they'll be following some fairly rigorous guidelines in terms of how that content is structured. So the whole concept of structured content and the concept of modular content is a bit hard to grasp initially. And so when doing that, obviously education is really important, and enabling people to see their content in context. Everybody gets all worried, oh, I'm going to write this little piece of information, and you can't really understand it out of the context of everything else. No, you can see it in context, but you probably see it in many different contexts. So having the ability to do that with your technology is important so that people can see the whole as well as a small piece that they're responsible for. You have the same sorts of things with reviewers. We have to educate reviewers that this is the only piece I want you to look at. Not everything else. Everything else has been signed off. Everything else is reviewed. Just this one little piece. We want you to review that. And again, it must be done in context. So you see the whole and you see the piece. So again, they can say, oh, the piece is correct and accurate, and I can see it as part of the whole, and it is accurate there as well. They may still find something in the other information, but we're trying to dissuade them from looking at that. We do have challenges in our design groups, because the whole thought of just pouring content in to a template and not tweaking it and not making a final change in it, that's hard too. So it really comes down to educating, showing them the benefits, showing them the how it's going to help them do their job better, faster, more accurately. And a lot of times it actually allows them to do more of what they want to do. And I'm just going to sort of finish answering that question with an anecdote. I was at a conference about 1.5 years ago, and somebody came up to me and introduced themselves, and they said, "Hi, I don't know if you remember me. Worked with our company 4 or 5 years ago." And she said, and I wanted to let you know that I used to hate your guts. I was like, okay, what does one say to that? You know, there's a whole group of people around, you know, everything else. It was like blush, whatever. And it's like, okay, I'm sorry to hear that. However, she qualified it, and I think that's why it was so potent, is she said, you know, structure was hard. Writing to, you know, a specific way of doing it, reusing things, putting creativity into the visual design of things, and putting creativity into making sure our content was optimized the best way possible was an issue. But she qualified it, and she said, now I love it. We can do so much more. We can do this. We can do that. We can do the other thing. And her comment was, structure sets you free. And I thought that was great. And so it really does illustrate, it's hard in the beginning, but you do come out the other end.
That is a wonderful quote, and I'm writing that down as we speak. Thank you. I think we have time for about one more question, and if anyone else has questions and want to put them into the question bar and we don't get to them, I can forward those along to Anne, and she and I will make sure they get a response via email. What suggestions do you have for identifying what the key issues are for management so you can address them in your ROI?
That's really a good question. And when we're putting together an ROI, it's wonderful to say we're going to save time, and we're going to do reuse, and we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. But they may not resonate with management. And I mentioned the one with the risk mitigation that one company had done. And what we need to do is to understand what are the hot buttons with management. So what I typically like to do is have a very short 15, 20-minute interview with senior management, senior management, as high up through the process as I can go. And I don't ask them about content management, and I don't ask them about reuse, and I don't ask them about mobile. I will ask them about, you know, what are the pain points? What are the, you know, what are the things that they feel are going to impact the company's ability to be successful in the future? And with whatever they say, then I put it in context. So somebody says, you know, reducing risk. Well, that's version control. That's, you know, consistent structure. That's workflow and sign-offs and things like that. So I ask them what they think is important, and then I put the solution into the context that they understand. So talking, listening, getting as much information from senior management as you can.
Great. Anne, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to everybody who joined us in our audience. This was, again, a wonderful, informative webinar, so thank you for joining us, Anne.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
And that is our time. We hope you will reach out to us with any additional questions or queries, and everybody go out there and make it a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.